"This is it," Mallory said, loud enough for the mic on her smartphone to pick up the words, even above the hissing of the wind. Her hand holding the device was shaking slightly from the cold, and she hardly felt her toes right now. But it was still worth it in her mind. She had found it. The old abandoned church. It stood here in the clearing like a titan resting among the trees. There were countless rumors about it. Tall tales and creepy stories that would have been spoken of 50 years ago and now swirled around the internet. From social media posts to old blogs, people seemed drawn to this place, to its history, and especially to its mysteries. The building itself was old, and it clearly showed on its exterior. Parts of the walls would have already stood here 300 years ago, while the newer, more modern additions were still well over a century old. And now, she was finally here, in its shadow, trembling from the cold and the wind. A wide smile appeared on her face, and Mallory looked back at the way she had come. The surrounding woods were as old as the church, and no one had bothered to clear out the underbrush in decades. Back in the time before the church had been abandoned, people would have trekked here from all over the place. 3 villages and 1 city had been close by, and, according to the stories from that time, many of them had chosen to walk for hours just to hear the young preacher's sermons every Sunday. Mallory felt doubtful about these stories, but she couldn't outright deny them either. Maybe there really had been a preacher that good. Maybe it was all just tall tales that had gotten inflated again and again over time. Whatever the case, something she definitely couldn't deny was that there was a certain air around this building. Standing in its shadow, staring up at the high tower that had once housed its bell, this strange sensation gripped her. Had it been the same back then? When had the church still been in use? Maybe... Mallory believed that there were spots on this planet where people could feel something else. Something they wouldn't be able to catch a glimpse of otherwise. Every time one of those spots was found, someone built something on it. Maybe a church, a temple, or a ritual site. It was an easy way to draw people in, to make them feel a certain way, even before any service had begun. And this place here was definitely one of those spots as well. She took a step and started walking around, ignoring the cold chill of the icy winds blowing in the shadow of the church. The places where windows had once been were boarded up, and the wood in there seemed like it had long since rotted through. It would probably be as cold in there as it was out here, Mallory thought with a disappointed sigh. Still, it would be less windy, and she could take some cool photos as well. The young woman pulled the hood of her jacket down and began walking toward the entrance. The backpack slung over her shoulder felt heavy, but for the moment, it didn't bother her much or at all. A coldness was seeping into her bones. Even with all the layers she was wearing, she started shivering in the icy winds. How had people lived through cold spells back then? She couldn't really imagine it, Mallory had to admit. Maybe they were just tougher back then because they had to be. Part of her doubted it. They probably wore just as many layers as she had on right now and froze just as much. Only, with hardly any journal or the like surviving until now, people lionized their ancestors' toughness. Mallory walked around the corner of the building, out of its shadow, and immediately spotted the old, giant, double-sided door. The sight took her breath away. It looked far better than she had imagined. The wood didn't show any holes. The hinges, while rusty, still seemed okay. And the aura it gave off made her forget the feeling of almost freezing to death for a few seconds. It felt like looking at the entrance of some kind of castle, Mallory thought. The thing that stuck out most to her was a rusted, brown and metallic heap lying right in front of the gate. A heavy chain with a lock, she realized almost immediately. They looked like they had hung there for decades and had fallen off only recently. Mallory moved closer. The cold wind seemed to grow stronger, burrowing into any and all gaps in her clothing. It felt like something didn't want her to proceed. A smirk formed on Mallory's lips as she pushed on, reached the door, and gave the fallen chain a kick that made it rattle as it slid to the side. The big doors were in front of her now. Should she take a few snapshots already? No. It was too cold for that. If she pulled out the expensive camera now, she'd drop it. And that would really turn this day into a nightmare. Mallory held out her almost frozen hand, grabbed one of the two handles of the door and pulled at it with all her might. It didn't move. At least at first. She could feel the strain in her elbow as she put one foot against the other part of the door and increased the pressure till she finally felt the giant hunk of wood and metal bending to her will. With a loud and ominous groan, the door started to move, and Mallory felt the atmosphere changing. A dark gap appeared, followed by the smell of dust and neglect. That sight was definitely something people back then hadn't witnessed. She groaned again, pulled once more, and watched the gap get bigger and bigger. From inside, carrying the stench, warm air seemed to flow out as well. She could feel her heart starting to pound. Even if it was only warmer in comparison to the freezing wind out here, Mallory wanted to quickly dive inside. She could at least warm up her frozen fingers and toes. And maybe take some photos, relax, and head back in a few hours. Mallory pulled with all her might and heard the hinges creaking as the door finally opened enough for her to push herself through. Out of breath, she let go and stepped back. Her arms were shaking, but she didn't care about that. Quickly, she pulled off the backpack, walked forward, and pushed herself through the small opening, feeling the warm air enveloping her body the second she reached the darkness of the gap. It really was dark in there. Even though her eyes were open, Mallory couldn't see anything inside the building. But again, she didn't care. Right now, her frozen fingers and toes were burning in the warm air of the abandoned church, which was far more important to her than the light conditions inside. Mallory managed to get herself through the gap, then reached back and pulled the door shut behind her. It was far easier than opening it, she found, and heard the hinges groan before the entrance closed, shutting out all the light from outside with an echoing thump. Mallory just stood there, in the darkness, for a few seconds, breathing heavily. That was when she first heard it. A drawn-out, low hum, she thought, then corrected herself in her mind immediately. No, it wasn't some kind of hum, but a single note. One from an instrument. A church organ. She looked around in the darkness, blinked, and pulled out her phone to light the way, as suddenly the interior of the building started to appear. It was like her eyes were growing accustomed to the dark, yet strangely different somehow. Slowly but steadily, she was able to make out the pews standing in front of her, the altar in the back, It felt like the darkness was receding, giving way to soft light. A part of her bristled at the thought, but Mallory was too amazed by what she saw to pay it any mind. The interior felt almost like it could still be in use. There were candelabras fixed to the massive columns. The pews looked old, but not a single one had broken down. A dirty red carpet was running between them from the entrance to the back of the church. Mallory took a few steps along it until she reached the first pews. There were even books still lying on the seats. It felt like she had been transported through time. Once more, the note played suddenly, and Mallory whirled around to look at the entrance. It wasn't coming from there. The doors were still shut tightly. No. Above the entrance, she could see the small balcony where a massive church organ stood. Its pipes reached up to the high ceiling, while the rest of it was hidden by the ornate banister around the balcony. Mallory felt her mouth run dry at the sight. Something about it bothered her deeply. She could feel a shiver running through her body, and this time it had nothing to do with the temperature. How could this thing have played the note right now? Was someone up there? No, that was impossible, right? Then, was it the wind? A breeze blowing through one of the pipes? Mallory couldn't feel any movement in the air around her, but that had to be the reason. She shook her head, turned around and put down the backpack. Her camera case was in there, as were the lenses. At first, she had thought she might be able to walk around with it outside, snapping photos the whole time, but after the long trek and the cold wind, she had changed her plans. It didn't matter much, Mallory told herself. The star of today's session would be the interior and nothing else. Looking around, she found dozens of possible angles and elements she could take great pictures of. With the light level being this low, she could even play around with the flash, trying different approaches to capture the mood of this church. That was one of her favorite things about this hobby. Visiting these abandoned places, feeling almost like an explorer. She checked the camera, chose a lens, and took a quick picture of one of the old books lying on the pew. Who had dropped it there? Why had no one taken it with them? She knew she wasn't the first to visit this place in the past 100 years, so how could anything still be here? This whole church felt like a single mystery. She took a photo of the altar up ahead, framed by the row of pews. The dark wooden planks covering the windows looked like giant dead eyes staring down at her from up there, and Mallory felt another chill. She just hoped that she'd be able to capture this exact feeling in her picture. Taking a step to the side, she took another shot. It looked like the wooden-boarded eyes were following her. Mallory bent down and snapped a picture, then stood up again and moved between the pews. The nave and altar felt and looked strange. They gave off this weird vibe, like they hadn't been abandoned for long or at all. A low note filled the air, but this time it was followed by a second one, and a sudden noise made her whirl around. Mallory could feel the vibration in the air coming from the small balcony with the organ. The entrance to the church was still shut, and she hadn't felt a single breeze since she pulled out the camera. Was someone in here with her? Up there by the organ? If there was, then why hadn't they called out to her? Did they want to scare her off? If so, they had chosen the wrong target. Mallory left the backpack behind as she walked back to the carpet, then opened her jacket and grabbed hold of the pepper spray with her free hand. She could see the small open door below the balcony and headed toward it. There was only one way up or down, so whoever had tried to scare her wouldn't simply be able to bail out of the back. Mallory readied herself and took a deep breath as she reached a small door leading to the tiny winding metal stairs that would bring her up to the organ. She could feel the strange tension in her chest as she looked at it for the first time. Would the steps even hold her weight? What if they broke as she ascended and she fell down and hurt herself? No. If someone was here messing with her, they would have taken the stairs themselves, proving that they were still usable. She stepped closer and looked at the railing. It was old, cast iron, as was the rest of the stairs. They had held out for centuries, Mallory told herself, and they wouldn't break now. At least that was what she wanted to believe. Drawing in a shallow breath, she grabbed hold of the railing and softly put one foot on the bottom step. It didn't make any strange sound, didn't bend under her weight, and didn't rattle the whole stairs. Mallory felt encouraged. She left the stony ground behind and started walking up. Her footsteps echoed back to her as she slowly ascended the stairs, the camera in one hand, the pepper spray in the other. The stairs really were small, tiny in fact. As she got higher, she could feel them slowly shifting with every step she took. If they broke now, her instincts warned, she'd plummet down and hit the hard stone ground, followed by the rest of the cast iron stairs. Mallory shook her head and continued on. Up there, someone might be waiting, and if there wasn't, she'd get a chance to take photos of the whole church from high above. A smirk formed on her lips, but Mallory didn't let it distract her from the task at hand. First, she needed to check if she was truly alone in here. Her feet hit the last bend of the stairs, and she could see the small balcony already. It was cramped, with the big instrument standing in the back, its pipes reaching up toward the high ceiling like fingers looking for something to grab onto. Mallory stopped for a moment. She thought she could see something move there, but as she concentrated on the spot, all it turned out to be was a shadow in the weak light, right by the organ's chair. Another shiver crawled up her spine. No, just a shadow, she thought, but gripped the pepper spray even tighter, holding it in front of her chest like a shield. She took another step while keeping an eye on the space up there. If someone was waiting for her, they would have to cower behind the side of the organ, which would mean that they couldn't be much bigger than a child. Still, Mallory felt that tension in her chest only rising as she took another 3 steps. Forgotten was the fear of the stairs collapsing, replaced by the strange sensation of looking for someone who was hiding from her. It felt wrong. That was the only way she could describe it. Her feet reached the balcony while she held the pepper spray in front of her, ready to cover anyone dumb enough to jump out at her. "Come out," Mallory said, and tried to keep her voice steady. No one answered. Nothing moved. "I know you're there!" She took another step and suddenly felt a soft breeze coming from the front. It smelled different from the rest of the church. Some kind of incense, she thought. The stench got stronger, and Mallory stopped. Something was here with her, part of her mind warned. Not just that. No. Someone was looking at her. She felt it, the eyes burrowing holes into her. Her pulse was racing. She could feel herself sweating. A note played on the organ, and the air around her started to vibrate. She staggered back only one step and watched in horror as a key of the instrument slowly moved up and the note got quieter and quieter before the sound completely disappeared. This wasn't the wind, Mallory thought, and felt the coldness creeping back into her bones. The shadow behind the organ seemed to move as the air in front of the instrument began to flicker. Mallory found herself frozen in place, unable to look away from what was happening there. Parts of her screamed that she should turn and run. Others begged her to take a photo. Whatever this was, it wasn't something she had ever seen before. Some kind of phenomenon was taking place in the old church. Without even thinking about it, Mallory raised her camera and began snapping photos as the air swirled and the shadows seemed to get drawn in. Another key on the instrument was pressed, and the low hum filled the air. There, in front of the organ, a figure started emerging from thin air. In the flash of her camera, the apparition flickered, then slowly stabilized as it played another note. Mallory felt a chill in her bones. Her hands were shaking and her teeth chattering, but she kept on taking pictures of what was happening right in front of her. The figure continued forming while staying almost completely translucent. It was a person, hunched over, sitting there, slowly moving their fingers across the black and white keys. A ghost? Mallory looked down at the small screen of the camera. It showed the last picture taken, and on it she could see the outlines of the figure sitting on the chair. Something rustled below. It was coming from the pews, and as Mallory looked over the railing and down, she could see the whole church filled with apparitions. They were sitting there, moving slightly as if they were real people. She hadn't heard them coming in, so they probably simply appeared out of thin air, like the organist up here with her. Mallory's heart was pounding in her chest. What was she witnessing right now? A ghost mass? She could feel the trembling of her legs as she looked down at them again. Slowly, the pews were filling up as more and more of them appeared. Bigger and smaller, the translucent figures materialized. They were varied. Some looked like adults, even elders, and others like children. Were they the souls of the people who had lived when the church had first been built, or the ones from when it had been closed down? Mallory shifted her body and pulled up the camera. She wanted to take pictures of the scene in front of her, but some part of her warned her not to get careless. It wasn't natural. Those things shouldn't be here. Maybe they could be dangerous, even. Mallory scoffed internally and let her shaking finger tap the camera's trigger. A flash of light illuminated the dark church, but no one seemed to notice. The figures sitting down there were all looking at the front, at the altar. It was empty. For now, a part of Mallory added. She could clearly feel it, though, that spot was important. It was hard to describe, but her heart started beating even faster as she looked at the altar. Something was coming, her instincts warned. Something big. She swallowed hard as another flash illuminated the area, and the camera took another photo. Even without looking down, Mallory knew that it would be shaky and blurred, but that didn't matter right now. She wanted to see what was about to happen. Needed to, if she was honest. At least some part of her felt drawn in by this strange scene developing in front of her. Benches of the pews were already filled to capacity. Every single spot held at least one of those apparitions, and they all waited, just like she did, for the appearance of the one leading the mass. Mallory looked around again. The church was just like before. There were no religious objects left anywhere, Mallory found. No. Part of her piped up. That was wrong. There had never existed any in the first place. This wasn't a Christian church, nor any other religions, she realized. Even in the old documents, no one had ever said which denomination it belonged to. Maybe that was the reason why so many people came here. And also the grounds for its sudden closure. A chill went through the air as the organ played another note and the ghosts in the pews suddenly stopped moving. This was it, Mallory thought, then quickly took another photo. In the flash of light, she could see shadows dancing over the altar. This time, it felt different. Shadows seemed to stretch even after the flash of light disappeared. They whirled around, broke apart, and then fused back together. Mallory watched the spectacle with bated breath. The apparition down there wasn't just appearing out of thin air. It formed itself out of the shadows on the ground. A hand materialized, gripping the stone slab of the floor. Then another. It almost looked like the thing was pulling itself out of the shadow. Mallory felt a bead of sweat running down the side of her face as she watched it closely. Her finger hovered over the camera's trigger, but she didn't dare press it again. Parts of her warned her not to. This thing down there was different from the rest. She watched it climb out of the ground and stand up to its full height, which was far taller than the rest. It wasn't translucent, but made of shadows, and the only thing she could clearly make out in its face was the eyes. White shapes in the dark skin. The apparitions sitting in the pews were shaking, trembling just like her legs. Another note from the organ cut through the silence and made the air of the building vibrate. Mallory looked down and could see the dark figure extending its arms as another shiver ran through the ghostly congregation. She couldn't hear a single sound coming from down there, but she was sure that the shadowy figure was talking to the other apparitions. They were softly starting to sway in this intricate rhythm as the dark thing up front began moving. Was this really what it had looked like 300 years ago? Priest or the like talking in front of his congregation? Then why were they still here? What had happened? Had they fallen for some kind of scheme? Had the church been closed down because of what they did in here? Mallory couldn't help but imagine it, and the thought alone gave her chills. What if it did happen like that? Was today an echo of the past? She doubted it. Something about the one standing by the altar made her want to run away. Even if the figures on the benches didn't notice her, the one up front might, her instincts warned. Mallory swallowed hard and tried to take a calm breath to steady her nerves as a trembling finger brushed over the trigger of the camera. The flash of light filled the church, and suddenly the figure up front stopped in its tracks. Mallory could see it, and even worse, she could feel it. The eyes of the thing, before focused on the altar, now moved over the group of apparitions filling the pews, then landed on her. She had never felt anything like it in her life. Coldness gripped her worse than the icy winds outside. Her breath caught in her throat. A single drop of sweat ran down her face and dripped on the stone floor of the balcony. It looked at her, stared at her with cold, white eyes. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her own voice was howling in her mind. It sees you. Slowly, the group of apparitions in the pews started to shift as well. They turned their heads almost in unison to look at her. Mallory couldn't care about that. All she could concentrate on was that damned shadowy thing with the white eyes, staring up at her. its gaze was holding her captive. She had intruded on its service, and this thing seemed angry. Next to her, even the organist had turned his head and was staring at her. The shivers running through her body almost made her stumble. Down there, by the altar, the thing lifted up an arm until its finger pointed at her. She needed to leave. Before her hands could even let go of the railing of the balcony, the leader of this congregation suddenly started moving. With its long legs, it made wide steps as it walked toward the carpet running between the pews, and Mallory felt its intent so clearly. This thing was coming for her. She could see the figure already marching toward the balcony as she finally managed to turn and head for the stairs. "No," part of her screamed as she looked down the winding steps. She wouldn't make it in time. It was coming for her, and she was about to run right into it. Mallory glanced out past the stairs and caught a glimpse of this thing's foot already appearing. She cursed as she jumped back and looked around. Up here, the only things she could see were the organ, the ghostly apparition of the organist, and the railing. No place to hide, Mallory screamed at herself in her mind. Something touched the stairs below, and an eerie sound filled the air. Her head shot around, and she stifled a shriek. Mallory could see the figure coming up the steps. Its eyes met hers for a split second, and this time she could see and feel the anger in them. She jumped back involuntarily, and her hip hit the railing with a thud. The stairs were vibrating. It wasn't the same sound they had given off when she had climbed them, but there was no doubt in her mind that it was from the thing coming up. Mallory scooted back as far as she could. If she tried to hide, it would drag her out. Her instincts warned her. There was no place to run to. She had to fight back. Mallory froze the next moment as something dark appeared on the stairs. A head of shadows with two white eyes came up and stopped. They stared at her, and she knew in that instant that there was no fighting back. It was big, even taller than she had imagined, and it was looking at her with this strange anger in its gaze. Mallory shivered, then saw the thing take another step. Inside her mind, her own voice screamed at her to run. One more step. The thing was as tall as her, even though it was only visible down to its hip. Mallory let out a scream, jumped, and pulled herself over the railing. She fell, dropped down, and tucked in her head as she tried to land on her feet. With a crunch, she hit the floor, felt the camera leave her grasp as it bounced off and shattered on the stone. A searing pain flooded through her hip as she rolled and immediately struggled to get up again. From above, she could still feel its presence. She needed to run. Mallory ignored the shattered camera on the ground. She started to run toward the entrance, praying in her mind that this thing would just let her leave. A dark note filled the church as the organist hit one of the keys again and made the air vibrate. She jumped forward, ignored the pain, and threw herself against the inside of the massive door. It budged just a bit, and a gap appeared. Mallory felt it. The thing was coming after her again. It wanted her. She rammed herself against the entrance once more, widened the gap, and then looked back. A dark body was appearing from the stairs. It wasn't a lie. This thing was after her still. She rammed herself against the door again, then pushed her head through the small gap. Sharp edges scraped her ears and the side of her face as she struggled to break free. Eyes fell upon her back. Mallory screamed in her mind as she ignored the pain, gripped the edge of the door, and forced her body through. Cold wind welcomed her suddenly as she lost her balance and rolled over the frozen ground outside of it. As she looked up, she could see it. A dark head and one white eye staring down at her from the gap between the doors. With With a bang, the entrance of the abandoned church suddenly fell shut. Mallory struggled to get back to her feet. She didn't care about the camera or her own pain at that moment. All she wanted to do, all she could think about, was running away. She needed to get out of there. With a loud groan, she started hobbling away. As inside the church, music began to be played, and the service continued.